Awesome. So, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining the webinar today. Yeah, so the topic of protecting bees as well as the pollinators seems to kind of be growing in popularity lately, but I know there's a lot of different information out there online, and often if we're looking for resources, it seems like a lot of it is kind of meant for people living in the States or Southern Alberta. It can be hard to find the right information for people who live up here in the county. So that's why we've invited two excellent speakers today. They're going to talk a bit about the type of pollinators that we have here, why they're important, what they do, as well as what we can all do and plant just to help protect them. And so following the two presentations, we will do the little draw for the door prize. And then after that, anyone who'd like to stay around and ask any questions can do so. And we can just have a little question and answer period after where anyone can just enter a question into the chat, and then our speakers will do their best to answer that. And then after the presentation today, it will be, since it's being recorded, we'll be able to send out a recording to everyone. So that way you can refer back to it if you have any questions down the road. And then we'll also send out a little reference document that has some recommended native plants and additional resources. So I'm just going to introduce the speakers quickly. First up, we have Bob Underschultz. He's an environmental technician for the nonprofit group, the Agroforestry and Woodlot Extension Society, or AWS. Bob works in a variety of areas such as project management, planting development, research, and extension and outreach. He enjoys planting projects with a focus on native species, natural development, and wildlife habitat. And when he's not at work, Bob can be found gardening or walking the Oz assistant dog. And so after Bob, we will have Trevor Floreani speaking. So Trevor was born and raised in Grande Prairie. He came to appreciate native plants and the outdoors by spending a lot of time at his family's former farm site in the Buffalo Lakes area. He studied geography at the University of Calgary, and then quickly after he returned to the Peace Country, where he worked as a research technician at the Center for Boreal Research in Peace River. And then from there, he was able to gain experience in plant ID and had a newfound appreciation for the complexity of trying to reclaim native forest ecosystems. So currently, Trevor is a rangeland agrologist, and he works with Alberta Environment and Parks, and he's based out of the Fairview office, just making sure that that public land, is properly managed for grazing. And he's also part of the Fairview Pollinator Garden Committee, which I think he'll be touching on in his presentation. So yeah, without further ado, we'll get started and let Bob take over.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Kate. Yeah, so I guess I'll be kind of doing the first half of this presentation, just kind of focusing on Alberta's native pollinators and the ones that are going to be around throughout the province. So kind of hopping into it, we Oz always likes to respectfully acknowledge, since we operate throughout the province, that we operate on Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 territory, the traditional lands of the Indigenous peoples of Canada and the homeland of the Métis. A little bit about who we are. So as Kate was mentioning before, we're a nonprofit organization, and our main mission is to increase awareness and knowledge of the economic, social, and environmental values of utilizing agroforestry and maintaining and protecting woodlots in the agricultural landscape throughout Alberta. And we offer extension and outreach services, as well as planting project services for land managers, whether it's landowners, farmers, acreage owners, areas of government. So, these are some of our members through Oz. And then in our organization, we have currently three members. So Megan Andre, she's our executive director, myself, and Brianna Wallace. So kind of getting into kind of the importance of pollination and native pollinators in Alberta. So kind of the biggest threat to our native pollinators is habitat fragmentation or loss of natural habitat. And that's mainly a result of industry, urban expansion, and agriculture. So you can see in this kind of blow up map of Alberta, in that Peace region, you can see where there's a focus of agricultural activity, kind of cutting into that natural boreal landscape there. And then basically what happens is that creates those fragments and isolates natural habitat for pollinators, increasing the distances they would have to travel and reducing that connectivity across the landscape. So in Alberta, approximately 2/3 of our province, which is around 62%, has been altered by industry or agricultural development. So it's a pretty big percentage. And like I said before, what that does is it basically reduces pollinator access, and then consequently lowers biodiversity throughout that food chain, because pollinators, they're a keystone species. And some of those other major threats on top of that loss of natural habitat are, the use of pesticides, large-scale monoculture farming. So when you're losing that biodiversity of plants, as well as the general spread of disease and kind of the ongoing impacts of climate change that are, basically felt throughout the world, but in Alberta, increasing changes within our ecoregions can have an impact on our pollinators. So kind of getting into some of the main ways that you'll be able to help them out is, basically, planting native flowering plants. And, you can do that with your backyard naturalization, or following basically any sort of, environmental organization that has a focus on that, as well as reducing your pesticide and herbicide use. So that's something that's common, especially in urban landscapes where, people spray their lawns to reduce weeds, or spot spray to kill weeds. So kind of an alternate option to that would be, removing weeds by hand or with tools, as well as, keeping some of those, dandelions on your lawn. Basically gives, pollinators a chance to take advantage of those flowering dandelions, and then kind of just mowing as you regularly would. As well as just, lessening your environmental impact on an individual level. So, just those typical environmentally friendly habits, such as, reducing your, personal consumption, personal pollution, and things like that. So kind of getting into pollination as we get down to the core of it. So it's basically about moving that pollen from the anthers to the stigma of the flowers. And so the way that pollinators do that is, they make contact with that anther, get those pollen grains on their body, and then come into contact on another flower with the stigma, and that is pollination. So it can be, wind, by wind or by water, or by animal, which would be the pollinators. So around 90% of our flowering plants need some sort of animal assistant with pollination. And those pollinating agents are responsible for that. So our ecosystem generally relies on this form of pollination. So especially our agricultural system for crop development. So especially canola, which is a big crop that we see everywhere in Alberta in those major agricultural landscapes. And the majority of Alberta's native bees are actually solitary, with bumblebees being one of those that are still social and maintain those colonies, but those colonies are often small compared to the larger European honeybee colonies that are brought in for those crop pollination services. So those native flowering plants that we're going to be discussing, they provide habitat for those pollinators, as well as that natural landscape that we want to keep intact, provides, habitat for nesting, whether it's through plant stems or bare open ground for, bumblebees to basically, take over old rodent burrows or within pieces of degrading wood. And just with this picture here, just kind of go over an example, the way that bees, more so with bumblebees and honeybees, they have what's called a scopa, and that's for carrying pollen. So basically on bumblebees, it's their leg basket, which is called a corbicula. And then honeybees will have something similar to that. So they kind of pack that pollen. And then that's something that, it's pretty common to see if you're ever watching out for bees. You can see that, pollen bag on their leg. Whereas some of our native solitary bees, they carry that pollen actually on the hairs under their abdomen, as opposed to the leg basket. So kind of reinforcing that importance of pollination. So those plants that they end up pollinating, they make up a third of our food supply. And that covers a whole range of produce that you're going to find in the grocery store, as well as the food supply of those other animals that exist in nature, that are going to be eating those fruits and nuts and seeds that are produced from pollination. So that basically is how pollinators are a keystone species, because they kind of affect all levels of the food chain. And by conserving those pollinators, we're conserving that habitat to keep producing food for us and to keep those other animals alive and well. And then, yeah, so who pollinates? Everybody knows, the bees, they're everywhere and they're fun to watch. But there's also other ones like some wasps, some flies, beetles, ants, butterflies is another popular one, moths, birds, even bats, and then some humans. We brush up against some pollen. I know it's pretty easy to get some willow pollen on your t-shirt walking through the woods. And then again, for agricultural production, European honeybees are responsible for a lot of it. And that's roughly valued at 3 to 5 billion in increased production in Canada annually. And the remainder is done by native bees. So there are about 4,000 species of wild bees in North America. And pollination is basically, it's not only important for those plants, it's again important for those animals that are going to be feeding on the fruit and seeds of those plants. So it's important to provide habitat for wildlife in general, and you're basically doing that by providing habitat for those pollinators. So the importance of native bees in Alberta, we have around 321 species of bees that are native to Alberta. Oftentimes, these native bees are actually more efficient than most other pollinators, including those honeybees that are used for agriculture. So they're pretty hardy and they're pretty good workers, because they often forage earlier in the day. They're kind of like mailmen, rain, sleet, snow, they'll be doing their pollinating activities, even when the temperatures are cooler earlier in the spring or later at the tail end of summer. And they also do a cool thing where they can buzz pollinate, which is oftentimes required for certain plants like tomatoes. So they're pretty impressive little guys when compared to your traditional honeybee. And so oftentimes there's a lot of different insects that might look like a bee, but actually aren't. So in this photo here, 3 of these are bees and 1 of them is not. And it's important to kind of understand what exactly distinguishes a bee. So often it's, bring the nectar and the pollen from different flowers back to their nests, whether it's, solitary or social colonies. When they land, they'll have 4 wings that are folded back. And that's a big distinguishment between bees from flies, but not wasps. So wasps won't usually have a way of carrying pollen back to their young to the same degree. So that's another way to tell the difference. But out of this photo, if you were trying to figure out, you can, take a guess now, but it's the one on the top left there, the hoverfly. So as I mentioned before, it's that kind of, the wings that are folded back, kind of gives it away. And then these other 3 bees, we got 2 sweat bees, and then we have, the infamous, or the famous bumblebee with the pollen sac on its leg there. Yeah, and then so those are just to touch on some of our bees, but we also, like I mentioned before, we have those other pollinators that help out. So one of them being hummingbirds, which are a rare treat if you get to see some of these guys. And kind of the main ones that you might see in the Peace region or in the Grande Prairie region there would be the ruby-throated or the rufous. And fun fact about the rufous hummingbird is that they're pretty aggressive defenders of their territory, and they've even been known to go after great horned owls. So they can pack quite a punch for their body weight. And some native plants in Alberta that you can use to attract them would be like bee balm, bearberry, which is in the image here, silvery lupin, and 20 honeysuckle, basically, which has those tubular shaped flowers that are going to be really attractive for the long beak of the hummingbird. And then we can kind of go into the butterflies that you might see. So two really common ones are the silvery blue butterfly on the bottom left there. The Canadian tiger swallowtail is another personal favorite of mine. So they're pretty large and pretty colorful. So the swallowtail there is actually on a wolf willow going after the nectar there. Basically what they do is, they use that, I always say this word is always tricky for me, but that the proboscis is inserted for nectar, and it contacts those anthers, as I previously mentioned. Pollen attaches to their proboscis, and any remaining pollen, once it's retracted and inserted into a new flower, is transferred to the stigma of that new flower. So that's how they help pollination. Some fun facts about the silvery blue is that their caterpillars have a symbiotic relationship with ants. So when the caterpillar is eating, so they often secrete a sugary secretion called honeydew. And basically the ants will protect them and tend to them in return for that sugary substance to feed off of. So it's kind of interesting there, as well as a lot of butterflies, the silvery blue and the swallowtail included, will often be seen puddling, which is when you see groups of them basically sipping up minerals and salts in mud puddles. And then we also have the Peck's skipper, which is another one you'll find around. And this guy, I got a quick video here. So this is a Peck's skipper on a lilac bush. So he's on the flower there. And if you watch the video, you can actually see its proboscis being inserted individually into each flower there. And that's kind of the way it will pollinate. So it'll get some of that pollen stuck on its tongue, and then, it's going to reinsert it and brush up against the stigma of the next flower. And these guys are kind of easy to spot. They kind of have a square or a kind of digital yellow pattern on their wings there. And now kind of going into the bees. So some common native bees in Alberta. We got the bumblebees. Everybody knows those ones. We got the sweat bees, miner bees, mason bees, and the leafcutter bees. So with bumblebees, like I said before, they're social bees, so they live in colonies above and below ground. We have roughly 28 species in Alberta. They're basically, the giant Chinook helicopters of the bee world. They don't really look like they're supposed to fly, but they do. And by far, they're the most commonly seen, most popular, and the most easily recognizable bee in Alberta. They're hardy little guys. Basically, they outperform honeybees and actually most of the other bees as well. So oftentimes the first, bee that you see in the early spring, those giant bumblebees you see flying around. Those are the queens, basically scouting to start their nest for the spring and summer. And like I said before, they have a unique trait called that buzz pollination, which they can vibrate pollen loose from certain flowers like tomatoes. Then we have the sweat bees, so named because they're attracted to sweat. So if they ever land on you, don't panic. They're probably just looking for a salty drink. And these guys, we have basically they are solitary bees and they will nest in the ground. And oftentimes they have that green or blue metallic sheen to them. So that's one easy way to identify those guys. Miner bees, those are that brown fuzzy guy on the top right there. Again, they're solitary, they'll nest in the ground, and they often find that they like willow flowers for their pollen. Mason bees and leafcutter bees, those guys are solitary, they'll nest in the ground or in holes in wood or hollow stems. And those are the ones that you'll see, they'll carry basically the pollen on their underbelly hairs. So you can kind of see that with the megachild there. It's got those hairs that line the bottom of its abdomen, and that's where the pollen will be picked up and transferred. Leafcutter bees have very large heads compared to their body, as you can see with the other bees there. Basically, that's to encompass those large leaf-cutting mandibles. And they're, as a bee, they really don't like to sting, so they're quite friendly. So basically, with those large mandibles, they'll cut patches out of the leaves to line their underground nests. And they often find that they prefer composite flowers, so like sunflowers, asters, the Susans. And then with mason bees, they will actually use pre-existing structures for nesting, oftentimes, so such as, past beetle burrows or plant stems. And these are the bees that will often utilize those man-made bee hotels that are pretty popular these days. So they'll basically go into those, deposit an egg, and then they'll seal up the entrance with mud. So if you ever look at your bee hotel, you'll see the ones that are kind of covered with that gray mud, and that means there's a occupied pod there, and that larvae will cocoon into an adult and basically spend the winter in there and emerge in the spring. And then again, mason bees, they'll once again outperform those honeybees when it comes to pollinating fruit trees. So they're very good for orchids, orchards. And they oftentimes quite like chokecherry trees, so the western chokecherry or Saskatoon bushes. Ultimately, when planting like a garden around native bees, you just want to focus on variety of flowers, but they really like blue, purple, and yellow flowers, as well as flowers that have a sweet fragrance. Kind of a fun fact with some bees, there's tales of them cheating, so they'll actually cheat and slice into the base of a flower, and they will steal the nectar without getting any pollen on themselves. So kind of stealing the nectar from the flower without giving that pollination services. But at the same time, there's some flowers that will cheat back, and they will entice pollinators in for nectar, but they actually won't produce any nectar, but they'll still get the benefit of pollen transfer from visiting pollinators, and kind of stiffing the bee for any nectar services there. So here we got another video of this bush, I believe, is a Tartarian honeysuckle, which is not native. But here we see, bumblebee working pretty hard, collecting some pollen and the nectar. And then I believe that's honeybee that is kind of sharing the same patch of flowers there. And if you ever really want a cool treat, if you have the bleeding heart plant, which is a popular plant in backyards, those flowers are kind of tricky for bumblebees to access, but they still go on it. I have one in my backyard, and it's really fun to see the bees access them, because basically the way they do it, you can get a really good view of their tongue trying to reach that nectar. So it's pretty fun to watch. And then here's another one. It's another bumblebee on what I think is a chokecherry tree. And I'll just it gets a little bit closer here, but you can see it's kind of going around the flowers there. And if you can, you'll get a glimpse of his kind of tongue darting in and out, trying to get that nectar. So the thing about, we have those, over 20 species of bumblebees, and to tell them apart, you kind of have to go by the stripings and colorings of their body. And I'll show a little graphic here in a little bit to go over that. So here is what I believe this is a mason bee on a red osier dogwood. And mason bees tend to be dark blue, green, or black in appearance, but they can also appear metallic, like the leaf, like the sweat bees. And they're often smaller than honeybees, so they're usually mistaken for large flies at first glance. But you just have to, give a closer look and see what it's up to. And then, there's an up close shot of the bumblebee again, so you can see that pollen basket on the leg there, and you can see what I was mentioning before with the banding to help differentiate it between different species of bumblebee. So this next image here, you can kind of see it's a really good one, trying to figure out exactly what bumblebee you're looking at, and whether it has those red or orange bands or those yellow and black pure bands on them. And kind of the life cycle of a bee colony, or the queen bee, you could say. So they start off, with waking up from that winter hibernation. And then, like I said, those giant bees that are searching for those nests. So they establish that nest, begin the egg laying. That colony starts producing male bees, and then eventually that colony will start to die off. The old queen will die, and the new queens will hatch, and they'll leave the nest, and the other male bees will go after them to mate, and then the mated queens will seek once again those overwintering sites, whether it's above ground or underground. So here's a cool video of a bumblebee. It's on a non-native flower, but it's a really good example of being able to see their tongue reach in for nectar. So you can see how he's rubbing himself all over those pollen grains there. You can see that tongue in the center there, kind of darting in and out. Yeah, so now going over kind of the habitat needs of pollinators. So you want to make sure they have reliable access to pollen and nectar, and that can be done by encouraging native wildflowers or planting your own, as well as access to nesting habitat and areas for overwintering, and then making sure that the environment is free of pesticides. You want that abundance of diverse flowers, especially again stressing the native wildflowers. Undisturbed shelter, so you want areas of if you have a backyard garden or you're working on a larger landscape, that are going to be undisturbed areas for nesting or winter hibernation. That can include bunches of grass, brush or rock piles, logs, and then again stressing the reducing or getting completely rid of pesticide use. You want to choose flowering species that often will come in different shapes, different sizes, different colors. That way there's, it will allow all those different pollinators with different, tongue lengths or different ways of accessing those flowers a chance for pollination, as well as you want to focus on different bloom periods. So you have, from spring to fall, you're going to have flowers available for these pollinators. So here we got a cool chart where it kind of shows all the different bee that we were kind of mentioning before. So those Adrena, which would be some of the minor bees, Bombus, which would be bumblebees, and then we got some of the sweat bees there, and then the Osmia, which would be a mason bee, and the leaf cutters, the maggochile. But you can kind of see how, that bumblebee, as I said before, how it's such an all-star for pollinating. It's kind of active all the way from April to September. And then you have, the mason bee, which is, spring to middle of the summer. And then the leaf cutters kind of overlap and take over from the middle of summer to the end of September. So that kind of stresses the importance of making sure you have flowering species that kind of cover that spring to fall period. So that way you're ensuring that you're covering the different active times of different native bee species. And then this chart, conversely, will shows some of the more common flowering periods for deciduous shrubs and trees in Alberta. And so, some popular ones like Saskatoon, you can see it has a pretty narrow window, whereas some other ones, like some of the willows, are really good. But essentially, you want to, when you combine, native flowers are going to be similar to this, where they have that, kind of different bloom periods, and you want to eventually overlap everything so that it covers that, period from early spring to late summer. So there's always something around for the pollinators. And then, yeah, stressing those wildflowers again. So on Oz, on our website, we have some native pollinator friendly plant lists for both the Aspen Parkland area and the boreal forest. So you can access those from there. And it kind of gives you a really good breakdown for each, month from spring to the end of summer of, which species are going to be blooming and, kind of what areas they're good for, whether, it's wet, dry, full sun, shade. Another important thing is when you're designing a pollinator garden or anything like that, you want to clump some flowering species together, basically to make things easy for the bees so they don't have to travel as far. So that constancy is very important. So something like 3 species per meter squared if you're clumping together herbaceous wildflowers. Again, native flowering species are the ideal choice. Oftentimes they're the ones, they're the preferred by pollinators, kind of have that collinear evolution. And they're less likely to provide habitat for, pests or invasive species. So the Alberta Native Plant Society, or the Council, they're a really good source for information, especially if you were looking at for different vendors to acquire some native plants. Yeah, and then nesting and overwintering. So roughly 80% of Alberta's wild bees will nest in the soil, actually. And each species has a different nest architecture, and usually, it's the, sorry guys, but it's the females who do all the work, and they'll collect the pollen and lay the eggs. So I think that's a picture of a mining bee, and basically those ground nesters prefer those open horizontal areas of soil, so devoid of any sort of surface vegetation or debris, often preferably some sandier soil rather than that thick clay. And so that's kind of what they're going after for there. And then the other 20%, they usually nest above ground. So you can see in that top photo there, you got some of that leaf and the leaf cutter surrounding that nest cavity. And then, as I mentioned before, with those mason bees, using those, on bee hotels, you often see those, either real or artificial pithy stems, and those can be anywhere from like 1 millimeter to 10 millimeters in width, and they'll lay their egg and then plug it up with that mud. And again, they can do that in the wild with tree bark and those pithy stems of plants. So oftentimes, like plants like reeds are really good, elderberry, honeysuckle, raspberry, anything with that nice stalk to it. Again, insecticides are pretty bad for most pollinators, and then herbicides, conversely, they'll affect their habitat that they rely on. So kind of reducing those or getting rid of those completely, if you have the action, can do a big thing, as well as when we develop shelterbelts or ecobuffers, they offer protection from the drift of pesticides or herbicides onto natural landscapes. So they do a big service there for kind of blocking that and helping out native habitat. This is an interesting kind of graphic, just showing the benefits of having those buffers next to agricultural production. Is basically bees or pollinators can only travel so far. Having those ecobuffers of diverse native species close to the field basically improves and provides that pollinating service. And then, so establishing that pollinator habitat, you're looking for potential sites, areas where you can plant and supply some species. But basically, the important thing is just to notice and protect the habitat that already exists. So areas where you're seeing wildflowers being growing, that's habitat that we want to keep that way, and ideally not destroy, because it always takes a lot longer to reintroduce that ideal habitat. And then another big thing is, in the case of beneficial insects, the thing, the saying, if you build it, they will come, only works if they're in the general area. And so if they have no way to get to your nice pollinator garden, because you live in such a fragmented area, that can be an issue. So basically you want to look to connect the existing habitat that is around there. So that's a big thing for like the agroforestry area, where those ecobuffers kind of start connecting natural areas of the landscape that still remain. So whether they act like wildlife corridors, basically allow that travel for those species so they can access those areas that they need. And the same with your, if you live in an urban area, your front yard and backyard, you can kind of connect to that by planting, in both areas. And then, eventually, if there's a string of houses that provide, ideal pollinator habitat, and then eventually leading to, a river valley or a ravine, basically that allows that connectivity across the landscape. So only to benefit the pollinators. But that's kind of the end of my spiel, focusing on pollinators. So I'll probably pass it off here to Trevor, and he's going to be talking about some of the wonderful native flowers and plants that Alberta can offer to those native pollinators.
Awesome. Thank you, Bob.
Sorry about that while I get adjusted here, but okay. All right, can you guys see the screen now?
Look great.
All right, perfect. Well, that was really good. I don't know if my presentation is going to be as slick as Bob's, but I'll see what I can add. There'll probably be a little bit of overlap, so I apologize if you hear us talk about certain things twice, but that just means they're important. So
Exactly.
yeah. So thanks for the opportunity to speak to you guys tonight, but I guess we'll jump right into things. If my presentation will work here. Okay, there we go. So there's a lot of reasons why people grow native plants, and Bob's already mentioned that. So, shelterbelts, ecobuffers, that kind of thing. Reclamation or rewilding for habitat creation. Some people are going for a certain look, so maybe they want to grow a wildflower meadow or that kind of thing. My favorite thing about native plants, or one of my favorite things, is they're already adapted to the environment. So you don't have to water them as much. You don't have to worry about fertilizing them as much. Oftentimes pests aren't a huge issue. And when your neighbors are outside frantically covering their, delicate perennials and annuals because of an impending frost, you can sit back and laugh because your plants can handle it no problem. They're a food source, so not just for wildlife, but for people as well. So Bob's already mentioned a number of plants like Saskatoon and chokecherry. There's, hazelnuts, raspberries, strawberries, all the stuff that we love to eat. And of course, that food source extends to nectar, which attracts pollinators, which is why we're here tonight. I like to think of this too. They're also a bit unique still. If you're growing native plants in your yard, people will hopefully get talking. And I throw a picture of my cat sitting in the front window there because he loves to sit and watch the little bugs that fly around. And I hope that my neighbors too will, like to watch them, and maybe we can start that conversation about why it's important to grow these and keep them on our landscape. So I just want to go right into some things here. A few plant species that I call the common culprits, or the usual suspects. These are native plants. They're often considered weedy, but sometimes they'll even grow in our own lawns. So they pop up fairly easily. And if they happen to show up in your garden bed, you might want to just try let them flower to see if you can attract any pollinators. So I'll just jump into some of these plants, and I think they're things that we should probably learn to appreciate a bit more, even if we kind of take them for granted most of the time. So just a note on species names. I know Bob had a few Latin names up on his previous slides with the bees, so I'll do that as well with my plants. You might not be used to seeing the binomial scientific names, but they're very important to know these if you're going to be growing native plants, so that you're growing a native plant. And it's part of the nerd in me as well that likes to geek out on the names, but it's something you should all learn, hopefully, if you're going to be planting something in your yard. There's a few names that are in brackets, and that's just because names change, and they've been changing at a very fast rate the last few years, just because with genetics and that kind of thing. So there can be multiple synonymous names for species. Don't worry too much about that. Just as long as you know one of them, should be able to confirm what it is. So we'll start with common yarrow. Everyone probably has seen this plant before. It has those white blooms. It's found in disturbed sites and lawns, overgrazed pastures, that kind of thing. And there's also a number of cultivated varieties of these, so you can probably order them in the catalog or at garden centers. They come in a bunch of different colors, which, although they wouldn't truly be considered, native, they're still a nectar source and a pollen source, so they will be utilized by bees and butterflies. I happen to have a patch in my front lawn that's a red variety of yarrow, and I let it grow out every summer, and it is very popular with the bumblebees. So it adds a little bit of interest to my lawn, and it's that much area less I don't have to mow either. So I just let it grow out. Another one, the diminutive early blue violet. You've probably seen this in your lawn if you have it, little blue to purple flowers. As its name suggests, it does flower early in the spring. It also flowers kind of throughout the summer, later in the season as well. Does well in a variety of habitats, so anything from lawns to the grasslands to forests, dry to more moist sites, and it's always a sure sign that spring has arrived. It's a really great plant to learn to appreciate because it's actually quite beautiful, I think. And everyone's favorite berry, the wild strawberry. So another species, it doesn't mind to be mowed. It avoids being grazed because it creeps along. That has those runners that we're probably familiar with. They're called stolons. You can actually propagate the plant from those stolons. If you put some soil around it, it will take root at those nodes, and you can create more little baby strawberries from it. And of course, this fruit is much tastier than any grocery store variety. And those flowers, when they're on, they attract pollinators to your yard as well. Showy Locoweed, this is another common one. It's in ditches and other disturbed areas. It's also at home on open grasslands and forest edges. And I think this one's quite ornamental in a lot of ways. It's very striking pink and purple blooms, coupled with that woolly, hairy, silvery foliage. Makes a strong accent to any garden. So this plant is easy to find, it's easy to collect seed from, and it's fairly easy to germinate as well. It's fun to play with. So it's also in the pea family. It will fix nitrogen in your soils, attracts pollinators, and locoweed, as the name suggests, if you eat too much of it, or I don't know, if you smoke it, it is a hallucinogenic, I guess. So it can be toxic, so just don't eat it, leave it for the bees. Pussytoes. So this is kind of a tricky group of plants to ID at times, but there's some common ones. So there's small-leaved, field pussytoes and rosy pussytoes. They're common in overgrazed pastures and that kind of thing. But they're a mat-forming species. They go really low to the ground, so they can make a good ground cover if that's what you're after. And those little flowers just kind of float above those basal leaves. And personally, my favorite's the rosy pussytoes, very bright pink and white blooms. And as you can see in the photo on the left there that I snapped at Lac Cardinal a couple years ago by Grimshaw. Fireweed, I had to put this one in. It's a bit of a polarizing plant. Some people love it, others hate it. But it is ubiquitous of the boreal forest, especially after fires. It's commonly encountered on disturbed ground. The blooms, they're usually pink. Sometimes you can find white ones. I've never found one, but I've heard they're out there. And they provide a very vibrant display if you can grow them in your yard. But because that plant is so aggressive, many don't find its behavior amicable to their garden plots. So it's tall, it spreads quickly through underground roots, underground stems, rhizomes, and produces a profusion of fluff when its seeds go ripe. So it's well suited to the right site. If you have a larger yard, I would say don't be afraid to put it in. It's also desirable in things like land reclamation and other bigger projects you might want to do to have a good competitive plant. So I have some of this growing in my yard, and I find with some regular root pruning, digging stems up, it's not that hard to control. It's not like a thistle or anything. So, with a little bit of work, you can keep it contained fairly easily. I can't get over how beautiful it looks. Plus, in the picture on the right, there's actually, if you look closely, there is a beetle of some kind. It looks like in the flower there. I don't know if it's pollinating or if it's hunting or what, but it's still making use of that plant. So pretty neat to see. So those are some things that can just pop up if you don't even try. But if you're looking to actually purposely go out and plant some things in your yard, you kind of have to do a bit of homework. And Bob already alluded to this stuff. So when you're looking to plant natives, usually revolves around looking at what you already have, what your growing location is like, and what species it can realistically grow there. So you need to consider the size of the area. You don't want to put things that are going to expand too much or invade areas you don't want to go. The exposure of your yard, is it open to the wind? Do you live on the bald prairie? Do you get bad Chinooks? Do you get a good snowpack to help insulate plants in the winter? Is your site full sun, or is it really shady? Your moisture regime is extremely important. So from wet to very dry. So xeric, everyone's probably heard the term xeriscaping for dry plants or desert plants. The term that's in the middle, if it's not too wet, not too dry, it's called mesic. Fertility and soil pH are important as well. Some plants do really well in acidic environments, others don't. Others need more basic conditions. Some native plants can be quite finicky that way. And even some plants, if they're grown in too rich of a soil, native plants, they'll get too leggy. They won't really have a nice growth form like you're used to seeing in their native habitat. So it's something to consider. Our soil texture is very important, how much clay, silt, or sand your soil has. And you probably have a fairly good idea of what your garden bed is like, or your lawn is like, or whatever. But it's always good once you kind of, know what you're dealing with. I like to go into nature, and then you figure out, you get inspired from there. So if you have a shady site, walk into a forest, see what's growing in the understory, figure out if you can grow a species from there. Conversely, if you have more of an alkaline open soil, maybe you go to the grasslands to figure out what the heck can I grow. And you can amend soils, you can do all kinds of things depending on how much work you want to do. So just some general practices, and Bob has already talked about this stuff quite a bit, but I'll just make a quick note about site preparation. To ensure that any planting is a success, you need to make sure you do things right from the start. So it can involve removing sod, digging up unwanted plants, even applying the bad herbicides to kill off non-native plants before you do any work done, just to have a clear bare site to begin with, can be something to consider if it's a big enough area, for example. Sometimes you need to work up the soil and decompact things, and sometimes you need to make sure you use a good mulch. I don't really have time to go in depth on this, but I know the Oz website has a lot of good resources on this, and I'm sure Bob would be happy to answer any more questions on that. But yeah. Again, Bob already talked about most of these, so I won't dwell on this slide much. If you're dealing with those native plants, those wildflowers that can grow in your lawn, defer mowing as much as you can. So there's, don't mow through the whole month of May if you can help it. That really helps overwintering insects that are kind of still waking up, not get mulched by your mower. So you can also think about rotational mowing, kind of like rotational grazing. You just leave certain areas of your lawn to grow out and see what flowers. And it's just a good way to disturb less ground. So yeah, Bob really already talked about most of this stuff. So just having a diversity of things to get a diversity of pollinators to come to your yard. Yeah, and having a water source can be really helpful for bees and butterflies. Something for them to stoop on to drink out of, as long as it doesn't become a mosquito bath as well. So let's flick through that. It's important to have a well thought out native plant garden, but you still need to have fun doing it. So you can kind of go as hardcore as you want. You could focus on planting a few species here and there, or you could, go all out, get something professionally designed and landscaped to feature only native plants. It's entirely up to you. So you also kind of decide the degree of nativeness, I call it there. So when selecting what plants you want to grow, for example, common milkweed, it is native to Canada, but not really native to Alberta. But if you wanted to grow, say, a plant that you find in the mountains, like egg leaf beard tongue, it's native to Alberta, but it's not native to the Peace Country of Alberta. So you kind of pick and choose, and you can go all out full hardcore. I'm only going to grow species that I collected myself within a 50-kilometer radius from my house. So it's kind of like, it's your wheelhouse. So as an example, and I don't have any pictures of what it actually looks like on the ground because it's being built right now, but we have the Fairview Pollinator Garden that's currently being constructed in town here. So I thought I'd put a plug into that. It's an example of more of a professionally done thing. We solicited the help of a landscape architecture student to come up with a plan for it, a schematic. And then we also have Cynthia Pohl is her name, from Living Lands Landscape and Design. She specializes in creating those pollinator hotels, which you can kind of see in the photo on the right there. So they serve as a, nesting cavities and little habitat for these bees, for certain types of bees and other insects, and serve as an artistic centerpiece as well. So it's kind of a visual centerpiece to go with it. So we were planning to have a wide variety of species in here, and our inspiration is our own backyard. So the Peace River Parkland, the boreal ecosystems that are very common all around the Peace Country. And eventually our goal is to educate the public on, how native plants on our landscape fit into that greater agroecological environment of where we live. And hopefully by next summer, so put that on your calendars for 2022, come on up to Fairview and check out the Pollinator Garden. We'll hopefully have some things buzzing about and making use of those plants. And again, Bob mentioned the Alberta Native Plant Council. I can't stress that enough either. Very important to check out their resources. They have a horticultural guide for use of their native plants. They have a list of current native plant vendors, so it's a good place to start. One of my biggest beefs is wildflower mixes that you might find in the garden centers or online. Don't plant them. They're usually Eurasian invasive species that aren't native to even Canada sometimes. So or they're native to Eastern Canada but very aggressive out here. So you have to be quite careful with those. Make sure you know what you're buying before you buy it and before you plant it especially. Avoid carnivorous plants. So if you see something like a sundew or a pitcher plant, or even plants like orchids, they're probably dug out of the ground and they're not really great to be growing in your garden anyway, so just avoid those. And know your ecoregion, so know where the heck in the world you are, what kind of climate you have, what kind of plants can actually survive in your yard. And then you have to decide if you're going to buy plants or if you're going to collect plants yourself, and how to do that ethically. So no matter what you do, it takes a lot of research, not a lot, but a little bit of research to make sure you're doing things right. So speaking of ecoregions, I just threw this map and hopefully you guys can make heads and tails of it, but it's the County of Grande Prairie is outlined in the purple there, and it just shows the major natural subregions. So it's dominated by that light green, which is the dry mixed wood, which is a form of boreal forest, and then that brown blob is the Peace River Parkland, which is more of a, well, it's parkland. It's transitioning between grassland and boreal, so there's more shrubby and actual native grasslands there. You'll also notice there's some lower foothills when you get up into the Saddle Hills country or in the southwest part of the province, as well as central mixed wood. The central mixed wood is very similar to dry mixed wood, just a bit wetter. But basically those mixed wood sites, those are your typical, dominated by trembling aspen. They have areas with white spruce. They're interspersed with wetlands. That the Peace River Parkland, it's drier. Its forest stands are more stunted. They're shorter. It's more shrubland and grassland out there. And as has already been mentioned, the vast majority of that Peace River Parkland has been basically lost. Very little of it exists in its native state or its natural state. It's long since been plowed under, or as you can see, the city of Grande Prairie swallowed up a big chunk of it. And if you're looking for inspiration, a great place to go to get a feel of it is Kleskun Hill, which is an absolute gem of the area. So if you haven't been there yet, you have to go. I just want to take a little moment here to highlight it. So this is the original Grande Prairie. Most of us who are on the prairies, from the prairies, actually don't see native prairie all that often. So this is a really cool spot. And the Peace Parkland naturalists, they're the naturalist group in Grande Prairie. They have a discovery guide, which can be found on their website, and it highlights the natural human history, and it goes through a list of a bunch of plant species and bird species that are common in the area. So you can use that as a bit of a guide to figure out what you can maybe grow. And if you can, in the summer, go out there every 2 weeks just to see what's growing, because it's constantly changing. It's a very dynamic landscape. So there's a variety of habitats within Kleskun Hills. There's, the wide open, the windswept prairie, you get shrublands, there's sheltered coulees that actually support forests. So as you go through these various eco sites, you can pick and choose, you can see what's growing out there, and you might want to try growing that yourself. So something like a smooth fleabane might catch your eye and you'll wonder, can I grow that? In terms of having a spot to go out to that's close to most people in the county, it's pretty hard to beat. It's a magical place, I would say. And of course, it's always good to be familiar with the native plants in your area. And I like to highlight the Plants of the Western Forest. It's probably the best all-around book that I've used for figuring out what flower I'm looking at, or what plant, or what tree. So if you're looking for a good plant to get started, or a good book to get started with plant ID, it's a good choice. There's plant ID apps now. Some of them, they're okay. They can be very dangerous tools though. If you don't know what you're doing, they're maybe not the best, but with platforms like iNaturalist nowadays, you can actually post photos and experts will weigh in and tell you what you're looking at, as long as you take good enough photos. And once you kind of know what you're dealing with, I mean, it can be a bit daunting to go out and figure out what is a native plant, what am I looking at? But if you have trouble, there's always people to talk to. So I'm always willing to answer. If you guys want to send me an email, I'm sure my details will be handed out, and I can try and help you out with plant ID or point you to someone who's smarter than me that can. Once you kind of know what you're looking at, you want to figure out, can that plant be grown in my yard, on my farm, in my garden, wherever? And a really good resource for that is Native Plants for the Short Season Yard by Lyndon Penner. Awesome book. Basically, it's specific to Alberta or the Western Prairies, the Chinook zone. He's actually from Saskatchewan, the guy that wrote it, so he knows his prairie plants, and it's a very good read for any gardener. So highly recommended for me. Collecting plants, I don't want to spend too much time on this slide because probably most of us won't go to the extent to do this, and it can be a bit tricky depending on where you are and what kind of access you have for sites to do it. But basically the big points are, don't dig up plants. That's the ANPC's position on it. The only time it's really acceptable is if you're on, usually deeded land that's going to be dug up anyway, or something's going to be built on there and you have permission from the landowner to go out and collect transplants. Generally, we don't want to see that happening on public land. So do it on your private land if you need to do it. Don't go to parks or public land to do it. What else do I want to talk about with this? You need to know your species. So every species is different, and it can take, you need to know how to store the species. If you're collecting seed or cuttings, does the seed require a stratification period? That's a cold, wet period, kind of mimics springtime conditions. Or does it need a scarification as well? That's physically or chemically breaking that seed coat so it can actually germinate. If you are collecting plant material, don't take more than 10%. That's kind of just a rule of thumb. You can also do things like cuttings. So willows, honeysuckles, dogwoods are all able to be grown from cuttings. Willows are probably the easiest one to do, but so if you have the time and the inclination and you kind of want to play around with it, if you can do it ethically, again, visit the ANPC website and they have guidelines on that'll help direct you. By far, I prefer purchasing plants. I will purchase a plug. So that's just a term for a rooted seedling. I'll purchase a plug over seeds any day of the week. You get flowering plants that much faster. And there's no vendors that I know of in the Peace Country, but there's a few in Alberta. Wild About Flowers is my favorite so far. They have really high quality stock. You can order them online. She ships them out in the spring during a week that you prefer, and you have really high quality plant material. You take them out of the package, you plant them in the ground, and you're good to go. There's a few other I have listed there that you can look up. Tree Time's a good one for seedlings. If they have their stock available, sometimes it's hit and miss, but you usually get pretty good quality stuff from them as well. And they have quite a number of native shrubs and trees available. Yeah, so now we'll go through just a few of the select flowering species that I thought, I've either had experience with them, growing them myself, or I see them all over the place and think they'd be good in the yard. and they're kind of specific to the Peace Country. So there's a lot of native plants from Alberta that don't really occur up here. I think like the silvery lupin, we don't have up here. Kind of some of the black-eyed Susans and other plants you might see, we don't really have them up here. But that's not to say we don't have anything cool. We just have a different flavor in the Peace Parkland and the boreal. So most of these should do pretty well in a yard. There's a few I have, exceptions. They'd do better on a dry pour or a xeriscaped yard, but you should be able to source most of these that I list from a plant vendor, or maybe even propagate it yourself. So prairie crocus, this is for many people the true harbinger of spring. Usually it starts poking out of the snow in April, and sometimes even late March, and starts to bloom. So it's really early. It provides a nectar source and pollen source for those pollinators to get out there if they're buzzing about. It's tricky to grow from seed, so I'd recommend you get this one from a plug. And if you are going to plant them, put them in a well-drained part of your yard where the snow first melts away. And don't plant tall things around them if you can help it. They get swallowed up really easily. So they pair well with something like a bearberry or other really low-growing things. And of course, willows. A lot of people kind of shrug or don't give willows a second thought, but they're very important for early spring pollen sources. And I've been told by actually a commercial honeybee guy that willows are very important for his operation. Their flowers, they're catkins, so similar to what you see on poplars. And there's a huge variety of willows, and they can be very hard to ID if you're not experienced. But there's two that I kind of highlighted, Bebs or beaked willow, as well as sandbar willow, which should be actually pretty easy to get either from vendors, or you could, collect yourself a cutting and probably grow them in the early spring. Yeah, I think they're underutilized, underappreciated, and if you already have a bigger yard, they're a neat thing to establish and kind of let go wild. And if you already have, say, a farm that has willow on it in, a slough or something, I would heavily consider or suggest that you leave that for the pollinators, for birds, for just, all the little wetlands out there that would thank you for doing that. Three-flowered avens, another early flowering species. It's still flowering right now from what I've seen out and about. It's starting to go to seed right now as well. So it has a couple of names, or more than a couple. Old Man's Whiskers, Prairie Smoke. It goes by a lot of names, but it's due to those distinctive seed heads. When they're ripe, it kind of looks like smoke or whiskers. And it's really neat to see a field full of them. So it's a very common species. You see them in open grasslands and meadows. You find them all over Kleskun Hill and along the major river valleys in the Peace. And the flower, before it seeds out, it's nodding. It's a purplish pink, and it opens up in May to June. So it performs really well in the garden. I actually really enjoy this. I never had to fertilize it or really water them once they're established. They're low maintenance, and they're not all that aggressive either. So they're quite a nice plant to grow. And you will get bumblebees coming along and other things to check them out too. Canada violet. This one's really common in our forests. It'll flower quite early as well. I have one in my front yard, and it starts to bloom in the beginning of May. And it will also self-sow. This one can be a bit more aggressive. It also spreads by rhizomes as well. So you kind of want to keep it in check a bit, but it has great potential as a ground cover species. Forms nice dense colonies and deep green heart-shaped leaves. So it's a really nice plant. Again, another super easy to grow, low maintenance plant that will greatly be loved by the bees. Tall lungwort or bluebells, everyone's probably seen these in the forest as well. They're quite shade tolerant, so if you have a spot that doesn't get a lot of light, it's one to consider. Both of these pictures, these are from my front yard, and these are growing basically in straight clay soil, and they're doing pretty well. They've been visited by the bumblebees this year, I've noticed, and those small blue nodding flowers, they do provide a little bit of color in your yard. And it's again, it's another plant. It will spread from rhizomes, so you might want to keep it in check depending on where you put it. But they're not that hard to contain, I find. So really neat plant. Slender blue beard tongue. This one has a really dark blue to almost purple flower. And it's a great addition to any wildflower grouping. So we've ordered some of these plugs for our Fairview pollinator garden. I have not grown them personally yet, but I've seen it out at Kleskun Hill. I've seen it along the river hills as well. And it appears to be very popular among Alberta native plant growers. So I think this would be a no-brainer to grow. It has one of those funnel-shaped kind of, has that beard tongue, the tongue-shaped flower on it. So a really neat specimen. Not a huge showy plant, but definitely a cool plant. Nodding onion. Now, this one's very commonly encountered on the dry prairie. You'll find them on the steep slopes in the Peace Parkland, also out at Kleskun Hill. But they will grow in your garden soil as well. I have some in my garden, and I love to munch on the flowers. They're particularly delicious, but the whole plant is edible, just like any other onion, so you can incorporate it into your food garden as well. It's also the closely related wild chive, which is found out at Kleskun. Usually found in wetter soils in the wild, but in your garden it should do fine. It's very closely related to your garden variety chive. Yeah, they just add, and again, super easy to grow once they're established. You almost have to kind of fight them off if you don't want them to keep growing. So stone crop, this is actually one of Alberta's native succulent plants. And I didn't even know we had it up here, but I found some near or south of Bear Canyon, almost at the BC border a couple years ago, growing on a rock just north of the Peace River. And lo and behold, it's also out at Kleskun Hill. We found some out this spring. The picture on the right is from my yard. I got it, ordered some plugs from Wild About Flowers, and it's actually proven to be another easy to keep plant. Barely have to water the thing. Flowers out almost every year. You'll get flowering stems and non-flowering stems, so it'll look a bit different depending on if it's a flowering stem or not. But the flowers aren't fully open in this photograph, but they do put on a pretty good display in the spring. Getting into some taller plants here. Giant hyssop, as the name suggests, it can be over 1 meter in height. Very common in the parkland or open forests. And if you have the space to grow it, I say put it in your yard, put it up against the fence. The blue to purple flowers, they're quite long-lived. They'll be visited by a ton of bumblebees in the summer, and plant does well in a variety of conditions, variety of soils. You can also make a tea from the leaves. So this plant is in the mint family. So if you walk by the plant or crush the leaves, it kind of smells like anise or kind of like licorice. The plant on the left, that's in my front yard, I think I germinated that from seed. So it's pretty easy to grow yourself if you can buy seed or collect it yourself. That's grown in partial shade in clay. So not the greatest. The plants in the middle are in my backyard in my pollinator patch in my garden, and they're doing much better. They bloom profusely, so it's a really neat plant. It's kind of the centerpiece of my garden right now, but easy to grow. Yeah, highly recommended for me. Wild bergamot, this is Bob mentioned this earlier as well, that bee balm, found in open meadows and woods, provides a dazzling pink flower. It's also in the mint family. In my experience, it's not as aggressive as the hyssop, and its leaves have more of an oregano flavor. So a lot of people like to make tea out of it, but I would probably put it on pizza myself. It has more of that flavor to it. I have not successfully germinated this plant, so I'm sure it requires some kind of stratification period, but you should be able to buy plugs of this fairly easily. It's another popular wildflower that's grown. Just make sure you're getting the Monarda fistulosa, the actual native variety, and not the common bee balms you might find that aren't exactly the same. Twining honeysuckle. So this one is actually a vine, and I'm trying to grow it against my chain link fence in my backyard. And you can see it in the forest quite often. It's growing up taller tree trunks or on other shrubs. And I grew this from a cutting, actually. It actually wasn't that hard to grow. I lucked out, I think. I collected some green wood last spring, very young growth, and put some rooting hormone on it. And it actually took and survived the winter, and it's gonna actually bloom this spring. So I'm pretty excited about that. But the flowers, they're trumpet shaped. They have that awesome funnel tubular shape to it, golden yellow, and they turn to kind of a deep orange as they get old. Unfortunately, the berries that it produces aren't edible, unlike its cousin, the haskap, but the birds do appreciate the fruit. And asters, of course, there's a number of varieties of these I highlight. Smooth aster and showy aster. They'll do well in full sun or partial shade. And they provide that late season pollen. I've seen showy aster blooming even to October after freezing temperatures some places. And they both have similar looking flowers, that classic daisy or aster looking flower, pink to purple, sometimes blue blooms in the case of smooth aster. They're easy to dig up. So even if you find these in the ditch somewhere, you can actually dig them up very easily. You can move them around your garden once they're established. They will spread by rhizomes as well. They'll seed in pretty easily. So again, another species you'll have to contain if you don't want it to get away from you. But you should be able to buy these fairly easily or grow them probably not too without too much difficulty. And goldenrod. So another one that can be much malined. Some people hate them, think they cause hay fever and that kind of thing. That's not actually true, but there's a number of these species as well. I prefer prairie goldenrod. It's a little bit smaller than your typical Canada goldenrod. It's a little easier to contain in the garden, but they pair really well with things like asters or other purple flowers. So the picture on the right, that's from my garden. That's goldenrod growing right beside a harebell. And I noticed last year I think it's a type of fly. I'm not totally sure, but it was just the goldenrods were covered in it. And so they were definitely getting used. It can be quite an aggressive plant, like I say. So if you're willing to control it, it's definitely something to consider growing. But yeah, it's a great little plant to grow. And that's about all I have. I had to narrow it down, so I apologize if I took too much time or not enough, but that's what I have for now, and some resources at the end if you guys want. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you, Trevor. And thank you, Bob. Those were both awesome presentations. And again, everyone listening in, this is all recorded. So I'll be able to send out the recording tomorrow, so you don't have to worry about, memorizing anything. All of the information will be available after. I think before we head into the question and answer period, I'll just do the quick little prize draw. So I'll just show you what we have. We have a little bee hotel. Oops, not sure if that'll. There we go. There, okay. So this is just a small one that you can keep in your yard. We have a seed mix. So this is from the Wild About Flowers place that Trevor was just mentioning. So it'll be weed free and all that good stuff. You won't have to worry. And it's meant for bees, butterflies, and birds. And then we also have a little pollinator garden sign that you can put in your yard. So I'm just going to do my best to share the screen here, and we'll do the name draw. Let's see. Okay. Congrats, Jody. You are the winner. So I will be in touch after this, and then we can arrange getting you your prize. I think so. Yep. Awesome. Okay, so now we will open the floor to questions. I know that we have one from Shelly already. So if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll have our speakers answer them.
Yeah, so I saw one about Indian paintbrush. Yeah, I know, I don't know about you, Trevor, but I know it's kind of more of a foothills montane kind of species.
Yeah, so there's a few species. There's a yellow and kind of the orange paintbrushes that you see in the montane, the foothills, um, which you could probably grow here as well. And then we have the pink and the purple paintbrushes, which I think are actually the same species. They might just be a subspecies of one another. But from what I understand, they can be a bit tricky to start from seed. So if you're able to get a plug, and I think you can buy them, you could definitely give it a try. They're an interesting plant in that they're hemiparasitic, so their roots will kind of hook into the roots of grasses. So they need a grass kind of a host, if you will, to really thrive. So if you have a patch of a meadow or something you want to slap it into, I'd say give it a try. And if you can collect seed, by all means, try to grow it. Whenever you're growing anything from a seed, probably the easiest thing to do is just plant it in the fall. Actually, you can plant it in a pot or mark up a spot in your garden, and then let nature do the rest. So the nature will do the stratification for you, and if it's going to bloom or germinate, then it hopefully will after in the springtime. So that's the easiest way to do it. I've never actually worked much with paintbrush, but yeah, I think it is doable.
Yeah, we got a new question here. Yeah, which plants that are native to us be your top choices for an area that has animals that may damage the plant? The hardiest plants.
I would go with I'm sure you're referring to our herbivores like our deer. Um, Nodding onion is one that's not particularly liked by ungulates, I've been told, as well as things like yarrow. So probably yarrow is also it's in the aster family. So if you're going to be planting things like yarrow, aster, um, sage, prairie sage, that kind of stuff, anything that's kind of more on the, I guess, smelly side probably would not be eaten as much. So and avoid things like dogwood and low bush cranberry that those guys really like to munch on. So
Yeah, deer candy.
yeah. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Bob, but that's
Yeah, I mean, like but you said, yeah, with some of the shrubs and trees, I could go into that for, yeah, they're generally a little more um, I guess, yeah, sought after from the ungulates. But yeah, I guess for like the lower, like the voles and the rabbits, I guess, yeah, as like you were saying before, if you have a more aggressive flowering wildflower, then it can recover faster if it does get browsed. That's one thing to consider. But chamomile seeds.
Again, depends on the on chamomile. If it's the stuff you're making tea out of, I get, like, you can plant it in your garden. As long as you can contain it, you can really plant anything as long as it's not a prohibited noxious. If you're planting scentless chamomile, which is the weed, then no, don't plant that. But yeah, I mean, it's up to you. I mean, chamomile wouldn't be native to Alberta, so it wouldn't fit in the native category. But you could definitely grow it as long as it's where you want it to be and not getting out of your yard.
Yep, yeah, kind of keeping those ornamental flowers and shrubs at bay.
Yeah.
I know when I was previously mentioned that the Tatarian honeysuckle bush, which is an ornamental plant that can get out into the the native areas. There's an interesting fact about that one. It's very has a very similar effect as catnip to cats. So whenever if you prune that plant, you kind of release that chemical. And I have a friend who has one in his backyard, and he never knew what the plant was. But then one time he actually pruned it, and he came home to a yard full of cats, and he had no idea why. So, yeah, you got to be careful with your ornamentals, make sure they're contained. So
yeah, and Tartarian honeysuckle is, if you're ever in Saskatoon Island Provincial Park or Crystal Lake or in Grande Prairie, it's all over the place in there. So it definitely has it's not as aggressive as Carigana, but and again, these plants like Carigana, even they'll be utilized by pollinators, but they really outcompete the native plants.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Awesome. I'll just give it a few more seconds in case anyone else has any other questions that they want to ask.
Definitely. I'm curious. When you showed the pictures of the twining honeysuckle in your backyard, because I've always been interested in that plant, but it's good to hear you've had some success growing it.
Yeah, I was actually quite surprised about that. Sometimes cuttings can be tricky to take. I also did it with the bracted honeysuckle, which is one of the other native honeysuckles to the area. But if you get it at the right time, and like I say, a little bit of rooting hormone, which you can find at Canadian Tire, helps a lot. And if they take root, they're pretty hardy plants. Awesome for birds, especially once they fruit, they bring in a bunch of stuff to your yard.
Yeah.
So, and they're very hardy plants too. So I was very interested in it from a perspective of trying to grow a native kind of a vine, rather than growing something like a hops or a non-native clematis.
No, for sure. Yeah.
So yeah, we'll see how it works out. I don't know how it's going to do, when we get really cold winters and it's all exposed on my fence and not in a sheltered forest, but see what it does.
No, it'd be interesting to follow that.
Awesome. Well, thank you both again, Trevor and Bob. That was awesome. I definitely learned a lot. And thank you everyone else who joined us tonight. I hope you had fun and learned something new. Also, a quick note, I just learned that I think next week is technically Canada Pollinator Week. I just found out about this. So pretty good timing, I guess. Hopefully everyone can get out in the garden and do something to help support the pollinators. Again, I'll be sending out the link to this webinar as well as some resources. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to any of us, and hope you all have a great rest of your evening.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks.